Hey friends, it's Sound Guy Barry once again, and I want your band to sound great. So in this video, I'm going to tell you the tale of two bands. Now, I just recently worked with two different bands on a Friday and a Saturday, and both of the bands were actually pretty similar. Now, they played different kinds of music, but they were similar in the fact that they were both really good groups of people, a lot of fun to work with. Both were really good groups of musicians who played their material well, and we had good shows both nights with good audience participation and good times, and both bands sounded really good. Well, pretty much. One band sounded fantastic and was a joy to mix. The other band sounded good, and the audience enjoyed them, but it was a real challenge to mix the band. And they didn't sound nearly as good as the first band. And I'm not talking about the playing ability of the bands. Both of them were excellent musicians. I'm talking about the acoustic, the audio performance of the band, and how clean and clear the band sounded, and how good the show sounded. A purely technical observation. And this was no surprise to me, but it was really pretty impressive, the difference in sound quality from one band to another band. Even though both of the bands are actually pretty similar, they were both structurally a pretty similar band in terms of drums, keyboards, guitar, bass, and a good number of people on stage, and all of them were singing. Well, almost all the musicians were singing. So in this video, I'm going to talk about those two different bands and what the difference was between the bands that made such an impact on their live show, and from that, give you my suggestions as a sound guy as to where you should be spending some of the money that you spend on your gear in order to get a better quality show. Now, I know that most of us have gear acquisition syndrome if you're a musician or a sound guy, and you're always looking for a new piece of equipment that is fascinating or interesting and would be fun to own. And I hope that this video gives you some of my insights as to where the most effective use of some of that money would go. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Barry. I'm a sound engineer in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. I know that it's real easy to browse through YouTube and come across a video that's interesting and then to not find that channel again. And so if you would please take a moment right now to just reach down there and smack the subscribe button. I'd also suggest that you hit the bell icon so that you're notified of new videos that come down. Okay, so on Friday and Saturday nights, I had two different bands, and like I say, the structure of the bands was actually pretty similar in terms of what's happening on stage. But one band was a joy to mix. They came through the PA system clean and clear and articulate, sounded fantastic. And when I mixed the band, every little tiny movement on the mixer was reflected instantly through the PA system, and it was like driving a Ferrari. It was just controllable, accurate, fun, and from song to song to song as the night went on, I didn't have to make a lot of adjustments, just little tiny tweaks here and there to keep everything nice and in balance, and they had a great sounding show, and we had a good show with the audience as well, of course. Then the other night, I had a pretty similar band situation. I mean, a different kind of music, but similar structure on stage with the band. But with these guys, I was chasing the band around all night long on the mixing board. Every single song, I was sitting here making tweaks and adjustments and trying to keep the band sounding consistent and in balance through the course of the night. And I also was pretty close to the edge of feedback in trying to get this band up in the levels where I wanted them to be in the house and keeping those vocals clean and clear above the band without having any instability in the mix, particularly with the background vocals. I found if I brought the background vocals up to where I really wanted them to be, the band lost its distinct sound. And so I was constantly sitting there at the board, watching the performers on stage, and when singers would come up, I'd elevate their levels to get them up in the mix, and when they backed off, I'd be pulling the mix down on those channels. And it was like just chasing these guys around all night long. I went home kind of tired after that show, actually. It was a struggle. Now, it ended up good, and the band sounded good, but I had to do a lot of work in order to get the band to sound good. So let's talk about the difference between these bands. The band that was really easy to mix and sounded great used auxiliary fed subs. So that means that I had a separate bus channel on the board for the subwoofers, and I only sent material from those channels that required sub support to the subs. So things like the kick drum, the bass guitar, the synthesizers, they all went into the subwoofers. But other things that didn't really have a lot of necessary low frequency output, such as snare drums and vocals, lead guitar, there isn't much low frequency energy in those instruments, and so therefore there's no need to route any of that signal into the subwoofers. So that takes out some of the mud in the mix, makes a cleaner, clearer sounding mix. The other difference between these two bands was the band that didn't sound very good is what I would consider a pretty typical normal type band situation where the musicians came up on stage, they brought their guitars and amplifiers and drums and keyboards and keyboard amps and all of this stuff, and they just set up kind of like they normally do for a practice session and jammed on stage, and we put up all mics for everybody, and everybody had a stage wedge, and the band played like, bands normally play. The other band, however, was band that is head up by a guy who's a pretty high-tech sort of individual. And he pays a lot of attention to not only how the band plays, but how the band presents on a live stage. And like I say, it's pretty high-tech. And so he doesn't have a guitar amplifier. Instead, he has a effect pedal, which is made by Fractal, which emulates an amplifier and goes direct into the PA. And there's no sound on stage. There's no wedges on stage in his band because everybody's wearing in-ear monitors. And so about the only sound that's happening on that band that's live is the acoustic drum kit. And so because of that, all of the signals that come in from his band were clean and clear and distinct into the mixing board. And I didn't have wedge monitors on stage blasting a bunch of extraneous noise onto stage that the microphones were picking up, and so the vocals came through clean and loud and clear and just gorgeous. And it sounded really good, The band was super easy to mix and sounded good. Because he wasn't using a regular old guitar amplifier, but instead he's using a Fractal pedal board, which does guitar amp emulation, all of his patches were lined up, so as he went from one guitar sound to another, there were very minor, if any, level bumps between them. So I wasn't chasing guitar levels around all the time for every time they changed sound. It made the band just super easy to mix, and they sounded so good in the house. It really sounded great. Now the other band came up, and they're using traditional stage wedges for their monitoring and traditional guitar amps, and it was a traditional, average hurricane of noise up on stage. And so all of that noise on stage is being picked up by the vocal mics on stage. And since everybody in the band is singing, well, there was quite a bit of background noise coming in, and this made for kind of a smeary, ugly sounding mid-range going through the band. The vocals weren't clean and clear. As I operated the controls on the mixing board, they didn't seem to have immediate absolute effect. It's kind of like pushing around a bowl of jello, And so that band didn't sound anywhere near as good. And that's how most bands are, And so the difference between the two bands in terms of sound quality was absolutely stunning, even though the two bands were both extremely talented, good musicians, and they both put on good shows. Now, it could be argued that I could just put on gates on their microphones to control a lot of that stuff. And that's true sometimes, but it wasn't true in this band. And the reason is that if you have strong, powerful vocals, and you have singers that get up and really belt it out, well, their vocal level is pretty high compared to the noise that's going on around them on stage. And in that situation, you can effectively gate the vocals, and when they step up and start singing, the gate opens up, lets the vocals out, and everything is fine. Now, of course, while they're singing, you're still going to get that background noise. But when the background singers are not singing, all that background noise doesn't get added into the mix. So, it's not a cure-all, but it helps a lot. Unfortunately, in this band, and in a lot of bands, the singers were not particularly strong and loud and powerful in their vocals. You know, they sang more like this. And when they do that, it's just not enough distance volume-wise above the background noise for me to effectively gate it. If I set the gates on those guys, the gates would block out their vocals in the soft passages, and that would cause consternation with the musicians, and it would impact the show. And so in that case, I just can't gate the vocals properly. And so I found myself manually running those levels up and down. When I pushed the background vocal levels up to where I really liked them to be, I was getting just so much splash and noise off of the stage wedges that it was making the whole band sound smeary. And because of that hurricane and noise on the stage and all this stuff coming off the wedges, we were also running pretty close to feedback. So I had to be real careful as to not push things too hard, otherwise I'd start getting into instability. And so that means that I had to dial back the overall entire volume of the band just a little bit in order to be able to get the vocals up high enough so that I had a balanced mix that was still stable. And of course, with the traditional guitar amps, every time they made some tone change, there was also a level change, which I had to compensate for back at the board. And so I was just chasing these guys around the board all night long. And like I say, it ended up sounding good, but it was a lot of work for me, and it didn't sound anywhere near as good as the first band with their setup. And so there's my tip, which is if you're a musician or a sound guy who's into gear acquisition syndrome, every time you look at a new piece of gear, you're going, oh, that would be great, nice guitar, I want to get one of those. Well, the thing that I would suggest that you spend your money on, or consider spending a good portion of your money on, are those things that will actually make your show sound better. Now, sure, maybe a certain guitar amp will have just a pristine, beautiful, creamy tone, but will it actually help the show in the context of a band? I would suggest that you should seek instruments that allow you to get great sounding tone. Maybe not the ultimate bestest sounding tone, but very good or great sounding tone at a very low volume level, or at with the ability to do a direct out right into the PA without putting noise on stage. Because the quieter your stage is, the better the sound is going to be in the house, generally speaking. And so my first band, lead guitar player is using a fractal board, had no sound on stage, and I got such beautiful, clear, clean guitar tones out of him. It sounded so good. And I would say that in the whole scope of things, using that guitar emulator sounded so much better than any guitar amp he could have put on stage. Now, sure, a Marshall Plexi has a beautiful, creamy tone to it, but in the context of the band, on stage, playing live, that creates enough background smear with the rest of the band that overall, it's not as good of a choice as using the digital emulator. That's my opinion, just as the sound guy. And likewise, if you can get rid of the stage wedges, that's a huge source of smeary background noise that does not contribute positively to your show. A lot of the changes that you can make to provide a better, clearer sounding show aren't that expensive. For example, instead of the stage wedges, if you're a keyboard player, for example, or a drummer, you could just use a little body pack like this for $50 and clip this on your belt and clip on some earbuds and have a monitor that sounds better and clearer than a stage wedge does and eliminates any of the issues that you would have with feedback or stage splash getting into the microphones, making your vocal sound indistinct and smeary. So that's my tip, folks, which is if you can reduce your stage levels, you'll have a much better sounding show. And it was demonstrated to me rather powerfully by having these two bands back to back last weekend. And I've, of course, experienced this many times before, but it was just a powerful reminder being able to do two shows with very similar bands with these differing setups. One of them using just traditional guitar amplifiers and stage wedges, and the other one you doing everything direct, no wedges whatsoever on stage, all in-ear monitors. And the difference in sound quality was absolutely stunning between the two bands. And the difference in ease of delivering the show was also pretty dramatic. One evening I went home feeling happy and joyous and going, wow, what a great show. That was a fantastic time. I wish we could have rocked all night. The other show I went home going, holy crap, I am exhausted. I'm glad we got that one in the bag and it went well. So, just a tip for you there, guys. If you're going to spend money on gear before, thinking about buying a fancy new guitar or guitar amp or some equipment like that, think about improving your stage monitoring and or buying equipment that has lower volume on stage. For example, maybe you want to look at cymbals that have lower decibel output than standard cymbals, which will make a big difference in how much splash comes into the rest of the band and makes the whole band sound smeary. So that's my tip for you on this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. It's just my opinion and my perspective, but as a sound guy who's done this for a while, that's what I've come to. And I hope you enjoy the video, and I hope you choose to subscribe and catch the next one coming up. Thanks for watching Sound Advice. Once again, my name is Barry, and I'm a sound engineer in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities area. If you need help with your band sound, or anything related to the technical side of your production, I'd be glad to help you out if I can, so hit me up. Have a great day, have great shows, and I wish you the best.